Let us get started with a motivation to neural networks. So, what are neural networks? Why do we need neural networks? What tasks can they do naturally, and why we think this as the basis for AI? Okay. So, let us define what this neural network is qualitatively. A neural network is a machine designed to model the way the brain performs a particular task. Or possibly a function of interest. So, we have seen the motivation to how brain computation happens, and we are interested in building or engineering systems or machines which can work and mimic the brain. So, that is our motivation, and neural network is such a machine designed to model the way the brain performs a particular task. So, our focus through this course would be on learning. So, we will be focusing on learning. Okay. And if you think about the motivation to this course or this subject, right, this is basically traditional signal processing area, right. So, it is basically an offshoot of signal processing. Traditional signal processing is linear in nature, and this is basically non-linear signal processing, right. So, our roots stem from 70 plus years of knowledge and experience in signal processing, and neural nets is basically non-linear signal processing. And neural networks provides us a way for non-linear processing of signals and efficient ways for realizing tasks. So, let us see a motivational example. Let us imagine we have points on a line that are like this. So, I will use two different colors. So, we have all these crosses. This belongs to one class, and I will use a different color, maybe green, and I have all these circles that are interspersed between these crosses, and they belong to another class, right. This is class 1 and this is class 2. Now, if I ask you this question, how many lines do you require to separate these classes? I just want to use lines to separate these classes, and let us say this goes on till infinity, right, on the real line. So, you can imagine the x's are all odd integers, and the round circles are all even integers, right, and we have these on the line. And if I want to have lines to separate these classes, how many such lines are possible, right? The answer is, you will need every line between these points, right, otherwise you cannot separate them, right. I cannot have one line that can separate these points. So, if you think about lines, so let me use this black. So I'll just probably have to have a boundary like this, another boundary like this, another boundary like this, and I have to have several cases where I will have to look at different regions where I can say that if it is between this and this, it is going to be a cross, otherwise it is going to be a circle and so on. But why cannot I do this in this way? If I have a curve, let me use this black marker again. Suppose I have a curve which goes like this. And if I say everything that is on this part of the curve are these circles, and everything which is lying on the other side of the curve are these crosses. So this is basically class 2 and this is basically class 1, right. So there is non-linearity here. With lines we could not separate these points, because with one line we could not separate these points, but with a curve we are able to classify these points. So this is a simple way to motivate such problems in daily life that we see. We see patterns which are not separable through lines, and we cannot have linear decision boundaries, and if we were to do this through nonlinear processing, how could we do that? And the answer to that is neural networks. So, and this is one of the ways in which you can learn these connections, and you can build such curves which can discriminate two classes. So, I think this is a motivational example. And suppose we want to ask this question, what a neural network is capable of, right? What is a neural network capable of, right? It is a nonlinear machine. It's a special kind of distributed machine. It can generalize and it can abstract the objects which are close to reality. It can abstract the entities, and it learns the input output mappings. It can adapt itself. So these are all the capabilities. So let me summarize this. We'll go to the next slide. One, it can learn non-linearities. So this is a special kind of distributed non-linearity, and it is endowed with better generalization / abstraction which is close to reality, right. This is one of the capabilities of a neural network. Next would be the input / output mappings. And when we think about conventional pattern recognition systems, we think about parametric forms and non-parametric forms. So if you know a priori what the distribution is, and you know certain parameters of this distribution, and you are interested in estimating the parameters of the distribution, then you can do so using well known statistical techniques, using maximum likelihood or other estimation techniques, and you can arrive at meaningful description of parametric forms. But in neural nets, the biggest advantage that you have in your hand is it is non-parametric. It learns the input points the way they are, but of course you have parameters embodied within the neural network model and the architecture, but you do not assume any parametric form of the underlying distribution. So, this is a very important capability, right. So, I will summarize this here. So, this is non-parametric it is a non-parametric statistical inference tool, and most important is adaptivity. So, the ability to adjust quickly to changing, or I would say a non-stationary environment is an important trait of any learning machine, right. If you think about conventional systems, you deal with stationary environment and you can kind of estimate the parameters and you can adjust yourself, but in the non-stationary environment the statistics are not the same. They are, you have time varying statistics, and a learning machine should be capable of adjusting quickly to the environment, and this capability is endowed within a neural network. Okay. And with these capabilities, now we have a rich set of tools. I mean, from conventional linear signal processing techniques, we are now going towards non-linear signal processing techniques which are robust. That is, you can handle input non-linearities, you can learn input output mappings, you have this adaptability property. Okay. So, now let us discuss a little bit about the stability plasticity dilemma. This was proposed by Grossberg. So, if you think about the gist of what this stability plasticity dilemma is as follows. Long time constants are required to ignore spurious disturbances at the same time. You need short time constants to respond to meaningful changes. A very good example is if you were to think about a learning machine, I mean a bot which is learning a classroom lecture. Let us say we want to endow it to learn a classroom lecture, right. So, the short time constant is basically connectivity of topics, right. I go from one topic to the other and I sense that change. I should be able to respond to that change quickly rather than worry about a clock ticking somewhere. It is basically a spurious signal. This is basically a spurious disturbance, and I need to have a long time constant which can ignore these spurious disturbances, right. So, there is an interplay between how you connect a short time constant which is myopic over a local window versus a longer time constant to ignore certain spurious disturbances, right. This is an important capability that a learning machine should be endowed with. So, there is stability, that is you ignore spurious disturbances, and there is plasticity, that means for small time changes you basically respond, and those are important time changes. So, what is important, what is not important, I think those rules have to be set in carefully for the learning machine for you to learn. I mean, you have to model these things mathematically to make the machine understand what is meaningful and what is not meaningful. Okay, so now we have some of these ideas, and what other properties do we need? We need to have evidential response. So what we mean by this is, what patterns to select, what about confidence about the decision, right? I mean, we want to reject ambiguous patterns and select those that are important for us. For example, if you are really focused, imagine a number plate recognition system, a particular drone which is endowed with AI capabilities wants to track a certain number plate, right? Its focus should be on the number plate, and that is a feature that it is really looking for, and it is that pattern which it wants to associate, right, and track, right, and it has to basically ignore other patterns around its vicinity, and that has to be ambiguous. It is an ambiguous pattern, it has to reject it, and it should have confidence about the decision, right. Imagine this is an application, you have a drone which has to track a number plate wherever it's, let us say it's a truck which has a number plate, and it has to track this truck somehow in a changing environment, and if it has to learn these things, it has to detect the patterns which are appropriate for it and reject ambiguous patterns, right. And then there is also a decision about a confidence about the decision it makes, and then keep improving upon this. This is evidential response. So we also have this contextual information. This is very important in the context of learning systems. And when you think about knowledge representation, so this is this happens, knowledge representation happens by the structure and activation of the neuron, right. We say a neural network has many neurons, and neurons are basically these processing elements, nonlinear processing elements, and knowledge representation happens through the structure and activation of the neuron, and for which you need contextual information. So what do we mean by contextual information, right? So when we think about a local, like we think about a local window, within this local window there is a certain context, and this is like a short term memory versus a long term memory, etc. So there is a contextual information. You cannot bring in something maybe way in the future or way in the past, maybe there is some connectivity, but you don't want to bring in those changes. But as you are making a conversation, or you are making a sequence of meaningful patterns, right, connected through time, there is a context to that information, and that information has to be embedded within the learning machine. So therefore the structure of this information and the activation of the neuron, they play a pivotal role in capturing this contextual information. A very good example is maybe automated dialogues with bots, right. I am conversing with a bot, it is not a human, and I say I issue certain commands, and this bot has to respond, and it has to go within the context, current context. There is a short term context, and there is also a long term thing, right. I mean, if I am asking it to switch on a certain device, turn on the geyser, switch off this light, etc., etc., there is a lot of contextual information that I am providing to this bot to basically respond in real time, right, and it is learning all these things. And there is this long term versus what happens if I did not shut off this light over 2 days or 3 days. So this is sort of a long term kind of consequence, but even that the bot should sort of engage itself to know things, right. So, this is very important in terms of knowledge representation, and if we were to automate everything the way a human does, how can we kind of build this intelligence into machines. So, this is one of the important connections. And another example for contextual information would be this movie. For example, I am watching this 3-hour movie, right. I am within this 10-minute section or in the 15-minute section, I have a certain dialogue and it is very local and it is contextual centric. But the overall theme of the story is not dependent on a particular dialogue, right. I have this 3-hour history where I have to know the entire context, right. So, there is this kind of information one learns, and we kind of summarize the 3-hour movie into a short abstract where we know what is the story behind it. At the same time, there are individual dialogues in between where we can kind of understand what is happening, right. So, all this is contextual information. And now if I were to ask you this question, can you engineer a machine that can respond to this information? Can you build intelligence into this machine? I think this is an interesting task. Next would be fault tolerance. So, fault tolerance is a very important property of any system, right, be it a artificial system or a natural system. This is a very important property. So, when we think about biological systems, we are fault tolerant in a natural way, right, the way from the gene selection happens, etc. There is always an immunity towards mutations and some of these aspects. Similarly, when we build artificial systems, they have to be fault tolerant. So, what do we mean? Suppose we have spurious signals, the performance of the system should degrade gracefully even under the worst kind of inputs and not be vulnerable to catastrophic failures, right. So, put in a nutshell, the learning system must not be vulnerable to catastrophic failures, and the performance must degrade gracefully under worst case / spurious inputs, right. This is very important. So, we can think about it in the context of error correction learning, right. For example, I say the sun, I have learned that the sun rises in the east, but for some reason there was an error that it says sun rises in the west. For some reason there is a typo, and I can make out from context it is not west, it has to be east, right. Another example is the dog chased the rat or the cat or something like that, but it cannot be the other way around, that a particular cat was chasing a dog, right. It is no, there is no meaning to that, right. So, if we were to bring in this kind of context and then the system has to be robust, it shows that it should be endowed with error correction learning capability. That means it has to be fault tolerant. So, if we were to ask this question, do humans, or I would say animals, or any living being code non-linearly? Is there a representation within our brain that is essentially non-linear, right? How do we learn things? How are we immune to faults, right? This is one of the important features, and particularly this is very important because we have to build in intelligence to machines, and for which we need to understand the kind of mappings, right. So, therefore, this is a very important step as to how we can endow it for fault tolerance. This is sort of a more engineering perspective. Now, when we think about theory, algorithms, etc., right? So, of course, we have the mathematics world, we conceive ideas and abstract things, and once we conceive these ideas and have an abstract form of the model, we build in mathematics and do analysis, we distill this in the form of an algorithm. But what next, right? If you have to have a system which is ready, it has to be in practice, right? It has to be as a hardware system, hardware, software, in a hybrid system, right? There should be some implementation of that. So, when we think about algorithms that have to be translated in practice, we think about VLSI implementation, implementability, right? Implementability in terms of VLSI. So, what we need is massively parallel and distributed structures for computational purposes, right. If we do things in parallel, we get higher throughput. If we can distribute the computational task, you can have several sub-processors which can work, and you can have a tremendous computational savings through that process, but it comes with a price because of the area, right. So, when we think about neuromorphic systems that are analog, mixed signal possibly, right, or even digital kind of systems, then I think this is a very important feature, right. When we have to realize algorithms to practice into systems, then we have to think about the VLSI capability of the algorithm, right. So, this parallel and distributed nature of the task has to be exploited. So, in general, what are these systems? I mean, these neural network systems, they are basically information processors. This is sort of very important. I would like to underline this word in red. They are information processors, right. So, we think about this is a processor for DSP, this is a processor for computation, etc., etc. Now, here this is an information processor because we are handling data non-linearly, we are kind of learning these mappings, and basically there is a lot of information we are learning, we are memorizing, and then we do it towards association pattern recall, etc., etc., these tasks which are all part of AI. Now, I think we have to spend a little time thinking about the neurobiological analogy I mean, when you think about the biological system and then this artificial system, what is it that we are trying to build, right? So, and if we think about the basic tasks, we have sensing. I will use different colors to distinguish things. We have signal processing. We have coding. We have communication. We have inference. Plenty of things, control and many others, right. So, there is everything. I mean, if you think about a human, we have sensory tools. I mean, we touch, we smell, we see through, we hear. These are all the cues that we get about the signal, right? Then is signal processing. Once we have these features extracted, when we get these signals, sensory signals, we want to extract features, and that's where signal processing plays a role. And then we also do nonlinear signal processing in terms of association of these patterns, etc., etc. And this is all this capability that we have. Then we code information. Knowledge is represented in some compact way in a parallel and distributed manner within our biological neurons, right? And there is coding happening naturally, that is spatiotemporal in nature, right? And there is communication. When we look at various stimuli, we are able to communicate and get the responses that are required for these stimuli. I mean, we associate patterns which we already have learned, and then we communicate based upon new stimuli. Then there is inference. This is very important because this is a decision making entity, right? We have to make decisions. So inference is very important. And then there is control, regulation, right? Whether it is open loop or closed. Typically these are closed loop control systems, and we have this closed loop feedback, right? And we do this in our normal routine. I mean, all these tasks are very natural in our normal routine, except that we do not understand this is signal processing, this is communication, this is control, this is sensing, etc., etc. But if we were to make a machine learn these capabilities, what can we do, right? We are touching upon all these areas, and it cannot learn like the way it is because it is not programmed. So you have to build in models, you have to endow it with intelligence, you have to start with principles, mathematics, and all these details which can make it work, right? And for which we need all these areas to touch upon. Okay, we will stop here.